What a night to be wandering. Come in, close the door behind you. You've found the right place. The rain is heavy tonight, and the wind is bitter. You've travelled far enough. Make yourself comfortable. The fire's been lit for hours, and it's not going anywhere, and neither am I. I am the keeper of the old stories, the ones too long for daylight, too strange for ordinary conversation, but too important to let the world forget. You won't need to stay awake for all of it. Just sit back, let the fire do its work, and listen. This place has a way of finding those who need it. Welcome to the Nox Archiva. Tonight we are going back, further back than living memory, further back than the oldest photograph, the oldest book on your shelf. We are going back nearly 3,000 years, to a cluster of low hills beside a slow brown river in the middle of Italy. There is nothing remarkable about this place, not yet. Just 7 hills, some marshland between them, shepherds' fires flickering on the slopes in the dark. The river is called the Tiber, and it bends here around an island, making the water shallow enough to cross. That's all this place is at the beginning, a river crossing, a convenient ford on the road between the mountains and the sea. And yet, from these hills will rise a city that conquers the entire Mediterranean world. A city whose language will echo in half the words you speak, whose laws will shape courtrooms 20 centuries after its fall, whose roads still lie beneath the highways of Europe, whose calendar still hangs on your wall, July for Julius, August for Augustus. Rome. For more than 1,000 years, this city will stand at the center of the Western world. It will be ruled by kings, then by no one, then by everyone, then by one man again. It will burn and be rebuilt and burn again. It will be loved and feared in equal measure, and when it finally falls, the people who come after will spend the next 1,500 years trying to build it back. Tonight, we will walk through all of it. Slowly. There is no rush here, no quiz at the end. If you drift off somewhere between the wolf and the emperors, that is exactly as it should be. The archive will still be here. Rome will still be here. It has, after all, gotten very good at waiting. So settle in. Let your shoulders sink. Let the day you just had grow small and far away, like a fire seen from across a dark valley. The gates are open. Let's begin. The wolf and the river. Every city tells itself a story about where it came from and its origins. Rome told itself too. The first story begins far away, in the smoke of a burning city. Troy. The Romans believed that when Troy fell to the Greeks, a prince named Aeneas escaped the flames, carrying his elderly father on his back and leading his young son by the hand. He sailed west for years, storm-tossed and grieving, until he landed on the coast of Italy. His descendants, the story said, would one day found a new Troy, a greater one. The poet Virgil would write this story down, centuries later, in the Aeneid, commissioned, not coincidentally, by an emperor who claimed Aeneas as his ancestor. History in Rome was always a little bit of a family business. The second story is stranger and older, and it's the one everybody remembers. Twin boys, Romulus and Remus. Legends say these were the sons of Mars, the war god, born to a priestess who was never supposed to have children. A jealous king ordered the infants drowned in the Tiber. But the river was in flood, and the basket carrying them snagged in the reeds at the foot of a hill, the Palatine Hill. And there, the story goes, a she-wolf found them. She did not eat them. She nursed them. She kept them warm in her den at the base of a fig tree until a shepherd discovered the boys and raised them as his own. It is worth pausing on that because Rome certainly did. A wolf, the predator every shepherd feared, choosing instead to give life. The Romans put her on their coins in their temples at the heart of how they saw themselves, nursed by something wild, fed from the very beginning on the milk of a hunter. The twins grew up, discovered who they were, overthrew the jealous king, and decided to found a city of their own, there, on the hills where the wolf had saved them. And then, in the way of brothers, they argued about which hill, about who would rule, about whose name the city would carry. The argument ended with Remus dead, killed, in the most famous version, by his own brother, after he mockingly leapt over the half-built walls of Romulus's city. Romulus buried him, finished the wall, and named the city after himself. Roma. The traditional date for this founding is 753 BC, April 21st to be precise, because Roman scholars later worked it out with the confidence of people who were absolutely making it up. But here's the thing. Archaeology tells us people really were living on the Palatine Hill by the 8th century BC. Simple huts of wood and thatch, post holes still visible in the rock today. The legend is a legend. The hill and the shepherds and the river, those were real. For its first 2.5 centuries, Rome was ruled by kings. Tradition counts 7 of them, starting with Romulus himself, and the list reads like a fable. A wise lawgiver, a warrior, a builder of harbours, and finally a tyrant. Under the kings, Rome slowly became a real city. The marshy valley between the hills was drained by a great sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, parts of which, remarkably, still function today. That drained marsh became the Forum, the open square that would be the beating heart of Roman public life for the next 1,000 years. A temple to Jupiter, best and greatest, rose on the Capitoline Hill. Several of the later kings were Etruscans, members of the sophisticated, mysterious civilization to Rome's north, whose language we still can't fully read. From the Etruscans, Rome borrowed the toga, the gladiatorial games, techniques of temple building and divination, the habit of reading the future in the flight of birds and the livers of sacrificed animals. Rome was always a borrower. It is one of the most consistent things about her. She took the alphabet from the Greeks by way of the Etruscans, gods from everyone she met, and eventually engineers and emperors from every corner of the world she conquered. Rome's genius was never purity. It was absorption. The last king was called Tarquin the Proud, and the name tells you how the story ends. He ruled by fear, ignored the council of elders, and his son committed a terrible crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia. Her death became the spark. Around 509 BC, the Romans rose up and drove the Tarquins out. And then they did something genuinely unusual for the ancient world. They didn't crown a new king. They decided, and you can almost hear the trauma in the decision, that no one man would ever hold that kind of power over Rome again. The very word king, or rather rex in their native tongue, became poison in the Roman mouth. 500 years later, men would still be murdered on the mere suspicion of wanting to be one. In place of a king, the Romans built something new, a thing they called the res publica, literally meaning the public thing, the people's business, and today we call it the Republic. The Republic of stubborn men. So how do you run a city when you've sworn never to have a king? The Roman answer was elegant, paranoid, and deeply strange. It was a machine built almost entirely out of distrust. At the top, instead of one ruler, there were two. The consuls, elected for a single year. Each one could veto the other. When the year ended, they stepped down and could be prosecuted for anything they'd done in office. Power in Rome came in small doses, on a timer, with an antidote standing right beside it. Beneath the consuls sat the Senate, several hundred elders, mostly former office holders, men who had spent their lives in public service. The Senate technically couldn't pass laws. It only gave advice. But in Rome, the advice of 300 of the most powerful men in the city was the kind of advice you took. And beneath it all, the assemblies of the people, who elected the officials and voted on the laws. On every official document, on the standards of the legions, Rome stamped 4 letters, SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. Not the king, not the state, the Senate and the people. There was even a built-in emergency brake. In a true crisis, the Republic could appoint a dictator, one man with absolute power. But only for 6 months. The word didn't mean then what it means now. The most famous early dictator was a farmer named Cincinnatus, who, as the story goes, was literally ploughing his field when the Senate's messengers arrived to tell him Rome was in danger. He took command, defeated the enemy in 16 days, resigned, and went back to his plough. Whether it happened exactly that way hardly matters. That was the ideal. Power as a burden you picked up, carried briefly, and set down again. Centuries later, George Washington would be called an American Cincinnatus for refusing a crown. There is a city in Ohio named after him. Rome's stories travel far. But the Republic had a fault line running straight through it, right from the beginning. Roman society was split into 2 orders. The patricians, a closed circle of ancient aristocratic families who monopolized the priesthoods, the courts, and, at first, every office that mattered. And the plebeians, everyone else, farmers, laborers, craftsmen, soldiers, the overwhelming majority of Rome. The plebeians fought in Rome's wars, paid Rome's taxes, and had almost no say in Rome's government. And they were not, it turned out, willing to accept that forever. Their weapon was remarkable. They didn't riot. They didn't burn the city. They simply left. On several occasions across 2 centuries, the plebeians simply walked out of Rome, the whole laboring, soldiering mass of them, and camped on a hill outside the walls. Historians call it the secession of the plebs. You might call it the first general strike in recorded history. The patricians could keep their ancestry and their privileges, the plebeians implied, and see how well those fought wars and harvested grain. It worked. Slowly, concession by concession, over about 200 years. A long, grinding, mostly bloodless struggle. the Romans themselves called the conflict of the orders. The plebeians won their own officials, the tribunes, whose persons were sacred and who could veto, literally, I forbid, any act of government that harmed the people. They won the right to know the laws, which were finally written down and posted publicly on 12 bronze tablets. They won the right to stand for the consulship itself, and eventually one of the 2 consuls each year had to be a plebeian. By around 287 BC, laws passed by the plebeian assembly bound everyone, patrician and plebeian alike. The 2 orders never became equal in wealth or prestige, but Rome had managed something rare in the ancient world: a revolution in slow motion, resolved with votes and walkouts instead of massacres. But before Rome could conquer anyone, it very nearly ceased to exist, and the wound it took shaped everything that came after. Around 390 BC, less than a lifetime after the Republic began, an army of Gauls came down from the north, tall, unfamiliar warriors from beyond the Alps, fighting in a style the Romans had never seen. At a small river called the Allia, the Roman army simply broke and ran. Days later, the Gauls walked into Rome itself, through open gates, and burned it. The survivors held out on the Capitoline Hill, the citadel above the Forum. One famous night, the story goes, the Gauls found a hidden path up the cliffs and climbed in silence. Past the sleeping sentries, past even the dogs. What woke the defenders were the sacred geese of Juno, kept at her temple, honking and beating their wings in the dark. The garrison scrambled up and threw the attackers from the rocks. Ever after, Rome honored its geese. In the end, the Gauls were paid to leave, 1,000 pounds of gold. And when the Romans complained that the weights on the scale were rigged, the Gallic chieftain Brennus threw his sword onto the pile as well, and answered with 2 words that Rome never, ever forgot: Vae victis, woe to the defeated. Rome rebuilt, hastily, crookedly. Its tangled streets were blamed on that panicked reconstruction for centuries. But the deeper rebuilding was in the Roman mind. The city resolved, with the single-mindedness of the traumatized, that it would never be the defeated again. It reorganized its army. It began fortifying, allying, expanding. Some historians see in that burned city the origin of Rome's most durable trait. It did not fight until it was safe. It fought until the other side could never threaten it again. And while Rome argued with itself at home, it was doing something else abroad. Relentlessly, methodically, generation after generation. It was conquering Italy. Not all at once. Rome fought its neighbours the way water wears down stone, the nearby Latin towns, the hill tribes of the Apennines, the Samnites, tough mountain people who beat Rome badly more than once and were beaten back anyway. The Etruscan cities to the north absorbed one by one. The Greek colonies of the south, with their marble temples and their philosophers, who called in a Greek king named Pyrrhus to defend them. Pyrrhus was one of the finest generals of his age. He brought war elephants, the first the Romans had ever seen. He defeated the legions twice, and after the second victory, surveying his losses, he is said to have remarked, "One more victory like this, and we are finished." He went home. The phrase stayed. To this day, a win that costs more than it gains is a Pyrrhic victory. What made Rome so hard to kill wasn't just the army. It was what Rome did after winning. Where other conquerors demanded tribute and left resentment behind, Rome offered its defeated enemies something unheard of: a path in, alliances, legal rights. For some, in time, citizenship itself, the ability to become Roman. Its former enemies became its future soldiers. Every city Rome absorbed made the next war easier to fight. Lose a battle, and Rome would simply raise another army from its allies, and another, and another. Pyrrhus reportedly compared fighting Rome to fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and two grow back. By 264 BC, Rome controlled virtually the entire Italian peninsula. A city of shepherds' huts had become the master of Italy in the space of a few centuries. And across a narrow strip of sea, less than 100 miles from Italy's southern tip, another power was watching. Carthage must be destroyed. Carthage sat on the coast of North Africa, near modern Tunis, a city founded by Phoenician traders centuries before Rome was anything at all. The Romans called Phoenicians Punici, which is why the three wars we're about to walk through are called the Punic Wars. Together they lasted more than a century. They were, by scale and stakes, something like a world war of the ancient Mediterranean, and they very nearly ended with Rome erased from history. The First War began, as world-changing things often do, over something small, a squabble involving mercenaries in a Sicilian city. Sicily lay right between the two powers, and neither could tolerate the other controlling it. There was just one problem for Rome. This would be a naval war, and Rome barely had a navy. Carthage was the greatest sea power in the western Mediterranean, heir to centuries of Phoenician seafaring. Rome was a nation of farmers and infantrymen. The story goes that the Romans built their first great war fleet by copying a captured Carthaginian warship, plank by plank, and trained their oarsmen on benches set up on dry land. It sounds absurd. It nearly was. Rome lost fleet after fleet to battle, and even more to storms. Some historians estimate the war cost Rome hundreds of ships and perhaps 100,000 men at sea, drowned wearing armor. Any sensible power would have quit. Rome built more ships, and the Romans changed the game itself. To a Carthaginian, a sea battle was elegant maneuver. Ram, withdraw, ram again. So the Romans bolted a boarding bridge with an iron spike onto their ship's bows. When an enemy vessel came close, the bridge slammed down, the spike bit into the enemy deck, and Roman legionaries stormed across. Rome had turned the sea into land. And on land, nobody beat Rome. After 23 brutal years, Carthage sued for peace. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The Republic, without quite planning to, had begun to become an empire. But the first war settled nothing. It only created a grudge, and the grudge had a name: Hannibal. Hannibal Barca was the son of a Carthaginian general from the First War. Legend says his father made him swear an oath at the altar as a 9-year-old boy that he would never be a friend to Rome. Whatever really happened at that altar, Hannibal spent his life keeping that promise. He is, by nearly universal agreement, one of the greatest military commanders who has ever lived. And in 218 BC, he did something Rome believed impossible. Rome controlled the sea now, An invasion of Italy by ship was out of the question. So Hannibal didn't come by sea. He came over the Alps. Picture it. An army of tens of thousands, Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, with cavalry, baggage, and 37 war elephants, climbing into the mountains as autumn turned to winter. Ice on the passes, hostile tribes rolling boulders from above. Paths so narrow that pack animals slipped and fell into ravines, and men froze where they slept. He lost perhaps half his army in those mountains. What came down onto the plains of northern Italy was frostbitten, starving, and exhausted. It then proceeded to destroy every Roman army sent against it. At the river Trebia, Hannibal lured the Romans into attacking across freezing water on empty stomachs into a prepared trap. At Lake Trasimene, he hid his entire army in the hills above a fog-covered lakeshore and ambushed a Roman army on the march. Tens of thousands killed or captured in a single morning, one of the largest ambushes in military history. And then came Cannae. In the summer of 216 BC, Rome gathered the largest army it had ever fielded, perhaps 80,000 men, determined to crush Hannibal by sheer weight. Hannibal, badly outnumbered, arranged his weakest troops in a bulging line at the center and let the Romans do exactly what they wanted to do. The Roman mass pushed forward. The Carthaginian center bent backward, slowly, deliberately, like a bow being drawn. The Romans pressed deeper, sensing victory, packing themselves tighter and tighter into the pocket. Then Hannibal's veterans on the wings turned inward. His cavalry, having driven off the Roman horse, slammed into the rear. The bow closed. 80,000 men were surrounded by 50,000. What followed was less a battle than an execution that lasted an afternoon. The ancient sources claim the better part of 50 to 70,000 Romans died at Cannae, on one day, in a space of a few square kilometers. Among them a consul, dozens of senators, and a fifth of the young male citizens of Rome. Rome's Italian allies began to waver. Some went over to Hannibal. In the city, the Romans, in their terror, did something they almost never did. They turned to human sacrifice, burying people alive in the forum to appease the gods. And then the Senate met and made a decision that tells you everything about Rome. They forbade the public mourning of the dead beyond 30 days. They thanked the surviving consul, the man whose army had just been annihilated, for not despairing of the Republic, and they declined even to discuss peace. Rome does not negotiate after losing. Rome raises another army. They armed criminals. They armed slaves, purchased with state funds and promised freedom. Boys enlisted young. Hannibal remained in Italy for over a decade, undefeated, unconquerable, and slowly, strategically, beside the point. Rome refused open battle and shadowed him everywhere, a strategy of patient starvation named for the general Fabius, the delayer. Men have been called Fabian strategists ever since. And meanwhile, Rome simply out-organized him. It sent its own armies to Spain, to Sicily, and finally to Africa itself, to threaten Carthage at home. Carthage recalled its greatest son to defend the city. And at Zama, in 202 BC, Hannibal was at last defeated on his own soil, beaten by a young Roman general who had survived Cannae as a teenager, studied Hannibal's methods his whole career, and turned them against their maker. His name was Scipio. Rome would call him Africanus. The Second War broke Carthage as a great power. The third, 50 years later, was not really a war at all. It was a demolition. An aging senator named Cato ended every speech he gave on any subject, grain prices, road repairs, anything, with the same sentence: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Rome, rich now and afraid of nothing except its own memories, eventually agreed. In 146 BC, after a 3-year siege, Roman soldiers took Carthage street by street, burned it for days, demolished what remained, and sold the survivors into slavery. A city of centuries was formally cursed and left as rubble. The tale that the Romans sowed the ground with salt is a later invention. But the truth needed no embellishment. That same year, on the other side of the sea, Rome sacked Corinth, one of the great cities of Greece. In a single year, the Mediterranean learned its new name. The Romans would come to call that sea, with terrifying casualness, Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Republic begins to crack. Here is one of history's quiet ironies. Rome survived Hannibal. What it could not survive was victory. Think about what those wars had done. Italy's small farmers, the backbone of the Republic, the men who filled the legions, had spent years, sometimes decades, away at war. Many came home to find their farms ruined or swallowed up by wealthy neighbors. Because the wars had also produced two things in enormous quantities: money and slaves. The rich bought up the land and worked it with slave labor on vast estates. The displaced farmers drifted into Rome, landless, jobless, and angry, a growing urban poor in a city with no real plan for them. And under Roman law of the time, a man with no property couldn't even serve in the army. The Republic's machinery had been built for a city-state of farmers. It was now trying to govern the Mediterranean. The bolts were starting to shear. The first men to really force the issue were two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, aristocrats, grandsons of Scipio Africanus himself, and tribunes of the people. Tiberius proposed something that sounded modest and landed like a thunderclap. Enforce an old law limiting how much public land any one man could hold, and redistribute the excess to the landless poor. The Senate's wealthy landholders saw it as robbery, and worse, they saw a tribune using the People's Assembly to bypass the Senate entirely, and then seeking re-election to stay in power. To them, that pattern had an old and hated shape, a king in the making. In 133 BC, a mob of senators and their followers, wielding clubs and broken bench legs, beat Tiberius Gracchus and hundreds of his supporters to death on the Capitoline Hill, and threw the bodies into the Tiber. Pause on that. For nearly 400 years, the Republic had resolved its internal conflicts, even the great struggle between patrician and plebeian, essentially without political bloodshed. That was the covenant beneath everything. That day, the covenant broke. Political murder had entered the Roman bloodstream. It would never leave. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius took up the cause, brilliant, radical, and doomed. He died in another round of political violence, along with thousands of his followers. The Republic had discovered that problems could be solved by killing the people who raised them. It is the kind of discovery that cannot be unmade. The next crack came through the army. A general named Gaius Marius, a self-made man, no ancient family behind him, needed soldiers for wars in Africa and against terrifying northern tribes on the move toward Italy. So he did the practical thing. He ignored the property requirement and enrolled the landless poor. It worked. Marius reorganized and re-equipped the legions and won his wars. His men jokingly called themselves Marius's mules for the loads he made them carry. He was elected consul an unprecedented number of times. But something fundamental had shifted, so quietly that few noticed at the time. The new soldiers had no farms to return to. Their pay, their loot, and above all the land they hoped to retire on. All of it depended not on the Senate, which was stingy with veterans, but on their general who fought for them. So the legion's loyalty followed the logic of their livelihood. They no longer served Rome exactly. They served the man who paid them, led them, and would fight the political battles to get them their land. Rome had created private armies. It just didn't know it yet. Before that discovery came one more convulsion, easy to overlook and impossible to overstate. Rome's Italian allies, the peoples who filled half its armies and had bled for it from Hannibal onward, had spent generations asking for citizenship and being refused. In 91 BC, they stopped asking. Nearly all of Italy rose against Rome at once, in a conflict called the Social War, from Socii, the Allies. And for 2 years, Italians and Romans, trained in the same tactics, killed each other with a competence no foreign enemy could match. Rome won the war by conceding the cause. Citizenship was extended to virtually every free man in Italy. It was the single largest enfranchisement in ancient history, and it quietly transformed what Roman meant. No longer one city, but a nation filling the whole peninsula. But the fighting had also filled Italy with veterans, grudges, and generals who now knew exactly how a Roman army performed against other Romans. They would not have to wonder for long. It found out through a man named Sulla. Sulla had been Marius's lieutenant, then his rival. The aging populist general and the aristocratic newcomer circling each other as Rome's politics curdled into factions. In 88 BC, a plum military command in the east was assigned to Sulla, then stripped from him by political maneuvering and handed to Marius. Sulla's response had no precedent in Roman history. He went to his legions, men who expected the riches of the Eastern campaign, and asked them to follow him, not east, to Rome. No Roman army had ever marched on the city itself. When Sulla crossed the sacred boundary under arms, nearly all his officers refused to follow. The horror of it was that strong. The common soldiers, bound to their general's fortunes, went with him. He took the city. His enemies fled or died. And when he later returned from the east, after Marius's faction had seized Rome in turn with its own massacres, Sulla came back with his veterans and fought a full-scale civil war on Italian soil, ending in a battle at the very gates of Rome. Then he taught the Republic a new word: prescription. Lists went up in the Forum. Names on the lists were condemned, property confiscated, killers rewarded. sons and grandsons barred from office. Thousands died, many of them merely rich, their names added because someone wanted their villa. Romans learned to walk to the forum each morning and check whether they had become, overnight, legally dead. And here is the strangest part of Sulla's story. He had himself appointed dictator, not for 6 months, but indefinitely, to restore the Republic. He rewrote the constitution to shackle the tribunes and empower the Senate, trying to bolt the door he himself had smashed open. And then, having done it, he resigned. Gave up absolute power, dismissed his guards, and retired to the countryside to write his memoirs, dying in bed soon after. He seems to have believed he had fixed things, but laws on paper could not compete with the lesson everyone had actually learned, the lesson written in the prescription lists and the blood on the temple steps. The rules are gone. The city belongs to whoever brings the most soldiers. And in these same years, the Republic was shaken from below by the people its victories had made invisible. We should be honest here in the dark about what held the Roman economy up. Slaves, millions of them by the late Republic, prisoners from the endless wars, sold in markets by the tens of thousands after a single campaign. Perhaps a third of Italy's population was enslaved. They worked the great estates, the mines, the kitchens, the classrooms. Educated Greek slaves tutored Roman children, while others died namelessly underground. Roman law was blunt about their status. A slave was not a person, but property, an instrument with a voice. Rome was many magnificent things. It was also always this. In 73 BC, at a gladiator school in Capua, about 70 enslaved fighters broke out with kitchen knives and skewers and fled to the slopes of a quiet, vine-covered mountain called Vesuvius. Their leader was a Thracian named Spartacus, once apparently a soldier himself, before Rome made him property. What followed stunned the world. Runaways poured in from the estates until Spartacus commanded a force the sources put at 70,000 or more. For 2 years, this army of the enslaved defeated one Roman force after another. Praetors, then both consuls of the Republic, beaten in the field by men who officially did not exist. Spartacus marched them the length of Italy to the Alps and freedom. And then, for reasons the sources never quite explain, the army turned back south into the trap of the peninsula. Rome gave the command to Crassus, the richest man in the state, hungry for the military glory money couldn't buy. He rebuilt discipline in his legions with old, terrible methods, cornered the rebellion in the toe of Italy, and destroyed it in a final battle in 71 BC. Spartacus died fighting. His body was never identified. And along the Appian Way, the great road running south from Rome, Crassus crucified 6,000 captured rebels, one cross after another, mile after mile, over 100 miles of them, left standing as the Republic's answer to the question the rebellion had asked. Pompey, marching home from Spain, mopped up some fugitives and cheerfully claimed credit for ending the war, beginning a rivalry with Crassus that would soon shape everything. Rome never institutionally reckoned with the revolt. It doubled the guards and changed nothing. But it did not forget the fear, and history did not forget Spartacus. A whole generation of ambitious young men absorbed that lesson in their bones. One of them, a 19-year-old aristocrat who appeared on Sulla's prescription lists and talked his way off them, was noted by Sulla himself, so the story goes, as a dangerous young man. In that boy, he supposedly warned, there are many Mariuses. The boy's name was Gaius Julius Caesar, the man who would not be king. Julius Caesar is one of those figures so famous that the fame gets in the way. Emperor, we tend to assume, but he never was one. Tyrant, said his killers. God, said the temple Rome later built him. Even the word itself outlived the man by 2,000 years. Kaiser in Germany, Tsar in Russia, both just Caesar, echoing down the centuries. So let's set the legend aside for a moment and just follow the man. He came from one of Rome's oldest families. The Julii claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, through Aeneas of Troy, but an old name with little recent power and less money. What Caesar had instead was a preposterous surplus of everything else: intelligence, charm, energy, nerve, and ambition of a purity that unsettled even the ambitious. The stories start early. Captured by pirates as a young man, he is said to have laughed at his ransom price and insisted they demand more. Then told his captors, pleasantly, that once freed, he would return and crucify them all. They thought it was a great joke from their witty guest. He raised a fleet, hunted them down, and did exactly what he had promised. In politics, he spent staggeringly, borrowing fortunes to fund games and public works, betting that fame now would buy power later, and power would pay the debts. And rather than fight the two most formidable men in Rome, he joined them. Pompey the Great, the most celebrated general alive, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Their informal pact, history calls it the First Triumvirate, quietly carved up the Republic's politics among three men. Caesar's share of the bargain was a consulship, and then a governorship in the north, a place at the edge of the Roman world. Gaul. What happened next took 9 years. Caesar conquered the whole of Gaul, most of modern France and Belgium, in a sequence of campaigns of astonishing speed, opportunism, and brutality. He bridged the Rhine in 10 days, just to demonstrate that he could, marched into Germany, and stepped back. He landed in Britain twice, the first Roman to do so, less for conquest than for the headline. And he wrote it all down. His commentaries on the Gallic War, composed in cool, clean, third-person prose. Caesar did this. Caesar decided that, were dispatched back to Rome, where they were read aloud and devoured. It may be the most successful campaign literature ever written, a general reporting his own glory in real time to the electorate that mattered. 2,000 years later, students still learn Latin from its famous opening line that all Gaul is divided into 3 parts. The price was paid by Gaul. The ancient sources, hostile and friendly alike, describe killing and enslavement on a scale of millions. Even some Romans were disturbed. The conquest made Caesar as rich as Crassus, as glorious as Pompey, and commander of an army of veterans who had followed him for a decade and would follow him anywhere. Which was now precisely the problem. Back in Rome, the triumvirate had rotted. Crassus was dead, killed with his army in the Parthian desert, Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's beloved wife, the human bond between the two men, had died in childbirth. Pompey drifted toward the Senate's old guard, who had always despised Caesar and were waiting for him with the courts. Because here was the trap. As a serving governor with his army, Caesar was immune from prosecution. The moment he laid down his command and entered Rome as a private citizen, his enemies would bury him in lawsuits, exile being the polite outcome. The Senate demanded exactly that. Disband your legions and come home alone. For months, offers and counter-offers crossed Italy. Caesar proposed mutual disarmament with Pompey. The hardliners refused. In the end, the Senate passed its final decree, and the tribunes who had vetoed on Caesar's behalf fled north to his camp, dressed as slaves. In January of 49 BC, Caesar stood with a single legion at a small river in northern Italy, the legal boundary of his province. The stream was called the Rubicon. Cross it under arms, and he was a traitor at war with his own country. He is said to have hesitated, genuinely, quietly, and then to have used a gambler's phrase from a Greek comedy, "Let the die be cast." He crossed. Ever since, crossing the Rubicon has meant the step you cannot take back. The civil war that followed ran the length of the Mediterranean: Italy, Spain, Greece, Egypt, Africa. Pompey was defeated at Pharsalus in Greece against nearly double his numbers, fled to Egypt, and was murdered on the beach by courtiers hoping to please the winner. When they presented Caesar with his rival's head, he said to have wept and had the killers executed. With Caesar, one is never entirely sure where grief ended and theatre began. Perhaps he wasn't either. In Egypt he lingered, famously, with the young Queen Cleopatra, restoring her to her throne. In Asia Minor he crushed a rebel king in a campaign so brisk his entire report home was 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. And unlike Sulla, and everyone noticed the difference, Caesar issued no prescriptions. His policy was clementia, pardon. Defeated enemies were forgiven, restored, even promoted. Among the men he pardoned were Brutus and Cassius. Hold on to those names. Master of the Roman world, Caesar governed like a man racing a clock only he could hear. Citizenship extended, colonies founded for veterans and the poor, debt crises diffused, plans drawn for libraries and law codes and draining marshes. And one reform that touches you personally, tonight: the calendar. Rome's old lunar calendar had drifted months out of season, so with Greek astronomers from Alexandria, Caesar rebuilt it. 365 days, a leap day every 4 years. That is, with one small later correction, the calendar on your wall. The month of his birth was renamed to honor him, July. But the honors kept escalating. A statue among the kings of old, a temple priest like a god's, and in February 44 BC, the title that broke everything: Dictator Perpetuo, dictator forever. The 6-month emergency break welded permanently on. He refused the diadem, the crown, when it was publicly offered 3 times at a festival. But to perhaps 60 senators, the refusal was theatre, and the pattern was ancient and unmistakable. The Republic's oldest nightmare, the word beneath all the other words: Rex, king. They called themselves the Liberators. On the 15th of March, the Ides in the Roman reckoning, 44 BC, Caesar attended a meeting of the Senate. He had dismissed his guard. There had been omens, warnings, a soothsayer's murmur about this very day. His wife had begged him to stay home. He went anyway. You do not rule Rome by hiding from it. They crowded around him with a petition. Someone pulled at his toga. Then the daggers came out, clumsy, frantic, 23 wounds, the conspirators cutting each other in the crush. He fought until he saw Brutus among them. Shakespeare gives him Latin at the end, et tu, Brute? The ancient sources tell it differently, and worse. Some say he said nothing at all, others that he spoke in Greek to Brutus, whom he had pardoned, promoted and perhaps loved as a son. Then he covered his face with his toga and fell at the foot of a statue of Pompey. The liberators marched out proclaiming the Republic restored and discovered within days that they had misread everything. The people did not rise in gratitude. They rioted in grief and burned the killers' houses. Caesar's will left his gardens to the public and money to every citizen. You cannot stab your way back to a world that no longer exists. The Republic they were restoring had died somewhere back with the Gracchi, with Sulla's lists, with the legions that loved their generals more than their state. And the will contained one more surprise, the name of Caesar's principal heir. Not Mark Antony, his loyal lieutenant, a sickly, unknown, 18-year-old great-nephew studying abroad. His name was Gaius Octavius. History would come to know him by another name. The first citizen. Nobody took the boy seriously. That was their first mistake and their last one, and most of them did not live long enough to make a third. Octavian, as we'll call him for now, was 18 when Caesar died. Frail, often ill, with no army, no political record, and a name that was suddenly either a death sentence or the most valuable inheritance in the world. Advisors, including his own mother, urged him to decline it and stay safe. He sailed to Italy and took the name. From that moment he called himself Caesar, and Caesar's veterans, thousands of hardened soldiers scattered across Italy, began to look at this teenager and see their general's blood. What followed was 14 years of maneuvering so cold and so patient that historians still argue about the man's inner life. He allied with the Senate against Antony, then with Antony against the Senate. Together with Antony, he did what Caesar had refused to do, brought back the prescriptions, and this time the lists included Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, whose head and hands were nailed up in the forum where he had given his speeches. At the Battle of Philippi, the armies of Brutus and Cassius were destroyed, and both liberators died by their own hands. The Roman world was then split between the two victors like an estate between heirs. Antony took the rich east, Octavian took Italy and the west. And everyone understood, without saying it aloud, that the arrangement was temporary. Rome had been down this road. The road always narrowed to one. In the east, Antony's story braided itself into one of the most famous romances in history, with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, the same queen who had been Caesar's lover. She was the last of the dynasty descended from Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy, the last pharaoh, in effect, of a civilization already 3,000 years old. brilliant, multilingual, supposedly the first of her Greek dynasty to even learn Egyptian, and playing the only hand she had, bind Egypt's fate to Rome's strongmen, one after another, and keep her kingdom alive. Antony and Cleopatra had children together. He granted her and them titles and territories in grand Eastern ceremonies. And back in Italy, Octavian, who controlled the story the way Caesar had always controlled the story, turned it all into poison. He wasn't fighting Antony, the propaganda said. No more civil wars, perish the thought. This was a foreign war, against a scheming Eastern queen who had bewitched a good Roman, against drunken Antony gone native in the decadent East. In a piece of theatre the Republic's ghosts would have appreciated, he even had Antony's will seized and read aloud to the Senate. It allegedly asked for burial in Alexandria, beside her. Rome gasped on cue. It ended at sea, off a promontory in western Greece called Actium in 31 BC. As naval battles go, it was strangely anticlimactic. Blockaded and outsupplied, Cleopatra's squadron broke through and fled. Antony followed her, and his abandoned fleet and army surrendered piecemeal. The war was effectively over in an afternoon. The following year, Octavian entered Egypt. Antony, told falsely that Cleopatra was dead, fell on his sword and died, so the story goes, in her arms. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded through Rome in chains as the exhibit in another man's triumph, arranged her own death. Tradition says the instrument was an asp, an Egyptian cobra, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. The serpent of Egyptian royalty, administering the last rites of the pharaohs. Egypt became a Roman province. The treasure of the Ptolemies paid Octavian's soldiers. He was 32 years old, and there was no one left to fight. And now came the problem that would define everything after. A problem harder than any battle. Julius Caesar had won absolute power, worn it openly, and been stabbed 23 times for it. The lesson was carved into his heir's mind. Rome would tolerate the reality of a king. What it could not tolerate was the sight of one. So Octavian performed one of the great magic tricks in political history. In 27 BC, before the Senate, he laid down all his extraordinary powers and declared the Republic restored. And the Senate, carefully prepared, deeply relieved, and entirely aware of where the legion's loyalty lay, begged him to stay on. It voted him provinces to govern, which happened, by pure coincidence, to be the provinces where nearly all the armies were stationed. It voted him honours, chief among them a new name with a shimmer of the sacred about it, Augustus, the revered one. He refused to be called king. He refused dictator. That word had been abolished, and he kept it buried. His preferred title was a masterpiece of understatement. Princeps, first citizen. Merely, you understand, the first among equals. The consuls were still elected every year. The Senate still met and was treated with elaborate courtesy. The forms of the old republic ran on like a beloved play performed nightly. While beneath the stage, one man held the armies, the treasury of Egypt, the tribune's untouchable sacredness, and the accumulated authority of 40 years of victory. The Romans even had a word for that intangible weight, and Augustus used it himself. Not more power than his colleagues, he wrote, only more auctoritas. Historians call the system the Principate. It was an empire wearing the Republic as a costume, and it was worn so well for so long that the costume held the empire together. And here is the uncomfortable truth the Romans themselves mostly stopped struggling with. It worked. After a century of proscriptions, civil wars, and legions marching on their own city, Cannae's worth of Roman dead inflicted by Romans again and again, Augustus gave the Mediterranean world something it had almost forgotten: quiet. 41 years of it under one steady hand. The frontiers pushed to rivers and deserts and held there. The legions cut down, professionalized, paid from a central treasury. Soldiers of the state again at last, or at least of the man who now was the state. Roads, aqueducts, temples, a marble makeover for the capital. He boasted, late in life, that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. They called the long peace that began with him the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It would hold, with interruptions, for roughly 2 centuries, the largest zone of peace, trade and travel the Western world had ever known, and by some measures would know again for a very long time. A merchant could ride from Syria to Spain on Roman roads, under Roman law, paying in Roman coin, and never cross a hostile border. Peace at the price of liberty. That was the trade, though no one was ever asked to sign it. The historian Tacitus, writing later with the coldest pen in Latin, put the darker view in the mouth of Rome's enemies. They make a desert and call it peace. Both things were true. That is rather the theme of Rome. Augustus died in his bed, a rare achievement in his family, in 14 AD at 75, having outlived his rivals, his colleagues, most of his intended heirs, and the very memory of how things had been before. His last words, by one account, were borrowed from the theatre. "If I have played my part well, applaud as I exit." The month of his greatest triumphs already bore his name. It still does. August. The Senate declared him a god, and the powers he had so carefully described as temporary, personal, and republican passed smoothly, silently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, to his adopted son. No law was ever passed creating the Roman Empire. It simply, one day, had always been there. One night in the Eternal City. Let's step away from the emperors and the battles for a while. Put down the sweep of history and pick up something smaller. One city, one night, somewhere in the reign of Augustus's successors, the height of the Roman peace. Come walk with me. It is an hour after sunset, and Rome, a city of perhaps 1 million people, the largest the world has ever seen, a size no European city will reach again for almost 2,000 years, is changing shifts. The low constant rumble, like distant thunder that never stops. Those are the carts. Wheeled traffic was banned from Rome's streets during the day. The crowds were simply too thick. So every night the deliveries come. Grain from Egypt and Africa, wine from the Italian hills, olive oil from Spain, marble, timber, fish, everything 1 million mouths and 1,000 construction sites demand. Iron-rimmed wheels grinding over stone, drivers cursing at intersections, all night, every night. The poet Juvenal, who lived here and complained magnificently about everything, wrote that only the rich could sleep in Rome, because only the rich had houses set back from the noise. For everyone else, the rumble of the carts was simply what night sounded like. Perhaps for a Roman it was soothing, the sound of the city being fed. You might imagine ancient Rome as a city of marble villas. A few thousand families lived that way. In the domus, the private townhouse turned inward around its courtyards, with mosaic floors and a pool open to the sky to catch the Rhone. Nearly everyone else lived in the sky. The insulae, the word means islands, were apartment blocks, 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories tall, packed along narrow streets. Tens of thousands of them, against a couple thousand private houses. Rome was, overwhelmingly, a city of renters. And Roman apartments inverted our logic. The ground floor, with its shops and running water and easy escape, was expensive. The higher you climbed, the cheaper it got. Up rickety staircases, past thinner walls, to the garrets under the roof tiles, where the poorest tenants lived with the pigeons. No water, no kitchen, no heat, except a charcoal brazier that might, if you were unlucky, burn the whole island down. Fire and collapse were the twin nightmares of the Roman renter. Buildings went up fast, and speculators cut every corner, and the satirists joked grimly that a crack in the wall was the landlord's problem only after it became the tenant's tomb. Rome eventually kept a professional fire brigade, thousands strong. The vigiles, who patrolled these very streets at night with buckets, axes and pumps. The night watch of the world's largest city, listening, like us, to the carts. If the streets rumble and the flats are dark and cramped, where did Romans actually live? Where was the warmth? Follow the smell of wood smoke and hot stone. The baths. By day, this building roars with life. But even now, banked furnaces breathe heat up through the hollow floors and walls. This is the hypocaust, slaves stoking fires below, hot air circulating under raised floors, so that a Roman padding barefoot across this room feels warmth rising through the marble itself. Underfloor heating, perfected 20 centuries before your radiator. The great imperial baths were free, or nearly so, subsidized by emperors who understood exactly what they were buying. Inside, cold plunge, warm room, hot room, gymnasiums, gardens, libraries, food stalls, masseurs scraping olive oil and the day's grime from your skin with a curved bronze blade. Senators and shopkeepers, side by side, undressed and equal for an hour. For the Roman crammed in a garret, the baths were the palace he owned a share of. This was where the city talked, flirted, gossiped, closed deals, and let the day dissolve. Every proper Roman town, from Britain to Syria, built its baths. Wherever the legions marched, the warm water followed. Hungry? Most Romans in those tall apartments had no kitchen. An open flame in a wooden building was how neighborhoods died. So Rome invented an old friend of yours, street food. The thermopolium, literally, a place that sells hot things, was a corner counter, its marble top inset with round mouths of deep jars, holding the day's stews, spiced wine, lentils, chickpeas, cheese, olives. Pompeii alone, a modest town, had around 80 of them. One was uncovered recently with its painted counter still bright, a hen, ducks, a dog on a leash, and traces of the last menu still in the jars. Pork, fish, snails, beef. The staples beneath it all were bread and olive oil and wine. wine nearly always cut with water. Drinking it neat was considered barbaric. And the empire's signature flavor on everything was garum, a fermented fish sauce, salty, savory, funky, shipped in amphorae from Spain to every corner of the Roman world. If that sounds strange, consider how much of the world today ends a recipe with a splash of fermented fish. Rome would feel right at home with a bottle of fish sauce from your own kitchen. And the grain in the bread, that came for a huge share of the city's poor from the state itself. The annona, a monthly dole of grain, later bread and oil and pork for hundreds of thousands of citizens. Emperors guarded that supply with their lives because Rome's rulers understood their compact with the crowd. The satirist Juvenal sneered that the people who had once commanded armies and elected consuls now longed anxiously for just two things: bread and circuses. He meant it as an insult. But since we're being fair to the Romans tonight, remember what the circuses actually were. The Circus Maximus, the chariot racing stadium in the valley below the palace, held perhaps 250,000 people. It was the largest sports venue ever built. It still is. A day at the races, 12 chariots thundering through the turns, 4 factions in team colours, blues, greens, reds, whites, with fans so devoted that they wore their colours, wrote curses against rival teams on lead tablets, and occasionally rioted. Star charioteers were slaves and freedmen who became the highest paid athletes, by some calculations, in the history of the world. Sound familiar? It should. We have not changed as much as we think. And the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheatre, to give its real name, where 50,000 watched the games that trouble us most to remember: the gladiators, the beast hunts, the executions. It was cruelty as spectacle, and Rome knew it and mostly did not care. A handful of philosophers looked away, and the crowd did not. We will not pretend otherwise. Rome was a warm hearth and a cold sword, always both at once, and it never apologized for either. The night is deepening now. The taverns are shuttering, the vigiles pass with their lanterns, even the carts are thinning out. Before we leave this chapter, stand a moment at the fountain. That sound, constant, casual, unremarkable, is one of the most extraordinary achievements in the ancient world. 11 aqueducts fed this city, striding across the countryside on arches, dropping only a few feet per mile across dozens of miles, engineered with a precision that still humbles modern surveyors. Hundreds of millions of gallons a day to baths, to private homes of the rich, and to more than 1,000 public fountains and basins like this one, free, running, day and night, for anyone with a jug. An official who managed the water supply, Frontinus, wrote a proud little book about it and asked, with the pyramids and the famous wonders of the Greeks in mind, whether any of them could compare with something so useful as this. That is Rome in one sentence, not the prettiest civilization, not the wisest. But water and the fountain, bread in the oven, warm floors in winter, roads that run straight to the horizon, the astonishing, unglamorous machinery of ordinary life at a scale no one had ever dared. The emperors. Augustus had solved every problem except one, the one he could not say out loud. If the Republic still existed, officially, legally, in every speech, then his position didn't. And a position that doesn't exist cannot be inherited. There was no crown to pass, no law of succession, no rule book at all. Every transfer of power at the top of Rome would be forever after an improvisation. Sometimes the improvisation was smooth, sometimes it was a murder. Rome ran on that uncertainty for 500 years. The first dynasty, his own family, the Julio Claudians, reads like a warning label for absolute power. Tiberius, the gloomy, capable stepson who never wanted the job, governed competently and grew darker with every year, finally withdrawing to the island of Capri and ruling by correspondence while treason trials thinned the aristocracy back in Rome. Then Caligula, the young darling of the army, the soldiers' mascot, whose nickname just means little boots. He began with promise and, most ancient writers agree, slid into something between tyranny and madness, humiliating the Senate for sport, declaring himself divine, spending fantastically. You may have heard he made his horse a consul. The ancient sources say only that he joked he might, which, senators noted grimly, was rather the point of the joke. After 4 years, his own bodyguards killed him in a palace corridor. And in the chaotic hours that followed, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protection force, discovered the true shape of Roman power. Ransacking the palace, they found, hiding behind a curtain, Caligula's uncle Claudius, middle-aged, stammering, limping, dismissed by his whole family as an embarrassment. The soldiers hauled him out and proclaimed him emperor. The guard had realized it could make emperors. It never forgot. The joke was on everyone. Claudius turned out to be one of the more effective emperors of the century, a scholar-historian who built harbours and aqueducts, expanded the government, and conquered Britain, the thing Julius Caesar had only gestured at. His weakness was his own household. The tradition says his last wife fed him poisoned mushrooms to clear the way for her teenage son. That son was Nero. Nero has become shorthand for the monstrous emperor, and he earned much of it, the murder of his own mother above all, a crime even Rome struggled to digest. But the most famous image, the emperor fiddling while Rome burned, needs correcting on 2 counts. There were no fiddles. Bowed instruments were centuries away. The instrument in the story is a lyre. And when the Great Fire of 64 AD devoured the city for days, our main source has him rushing back to Rome, opening public buildings to the homeless and driving down the price of grain. The rumor that he had sung of the fall of Troy while the city glowed may have chased him precisely because the relief effort came from a man everyone already believed capable of it. He then made it all infinitely worse, seizing burned land for a vast golden palace and finding scapegoats for the fire in a small, unpopular new sect, the Christians, whose persecution under Nero was remembered for 2,000 years. When the armies finally turned on him, Nero died by his own hand, allegedly lamenting, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30. The dynasty of Caesar and Augustus was extinct, and the year after his death taught Rome an ugly lesson in plain sight. 4 emperors in a single year, raised and destroyed by rival armies. The historian Tacitus wrote that the secret of empire was now out. emperors could be made elsewhere than at Rome. The legions had always held the real power. Now they knew it too. And yet, and this is the strange resilience of the thing Augustus built, the machine kept running. Grain ships sailed, courts sat, roads were repaired, whether the palace held a philosopher or a matricide. Out of the chaos came a blunt soldier, Vespasian, who stabilized everything, taxed everything, even the public urinals, cheerfully telling his squeamish son that money doesn't smell, and began, on the site of Nero's private golden lake, a gift to the public, the Colosseum. Rome even laughed again. Vespasian's reported last words mocked the whole imperial cult. Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god. Vespasian had risen on the back of a grim war in the east. In 66 AD, the province of Judea had risen against Roman rule, driven by taxation, misgovernment, and a faith that, like the Christians who sprang from it, would not bow to the gods of the state. The war was long and pitiless, and it ended in 70 AD with Vespasian's son Titus besieging Jerusalem itself. When the city fell, the Second Temple, the center of Jewish worship, one of the wonders of the age, was burned to the ground. Its treasures were carried to Rome and paraded in triumph. You can still see them today, carved in marble on the Arch of Titus beside the Forum, soldiers shouldering the great seven-branched menorah. The temple was never rebuilt. Its one surviving retaining wall, the Western Wall, is prayed at in Jerusalem to this night. And the spoils of that war helped pay for the Colosseum. Rome's most famous monument was built, in part, with the wealth of a destroyed sanctuary, by the labor of its captives. The stones of Rome are never only one story. Titus succeeded his father, and his short reign was swallowed by catastrophe. In the summer of 79 AD, that quiet, vine-covered mountain where Spartacus had once camped announced what it truly was. Vesuvius erupted with a force that split the sky, hurling a column of ash and stone miles upward, raining pumice on the towns below, and then, in the dark hours, sending down the surges of superheated gas and ash that ended everything they touched. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were not destroyed exactly. They were sealed, buried whole, streets and bakeries and painted counters and loaves still in the ovens under meters of ash. We know the day almost hour by hour, because a teenager watched it from across the bay and later wrote it down. Pliny the Younger, whose account is the first detailed description of such an eruption in history. Volcanologists still call them Plinian eruptions. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, admiral, naturalist, author of a 37-volume encyclopedia, sailed toward the disaster to rescue survivors, telling his hesitating helmsman that fortune favors the bold. He died on that shore, and the buried towns slept under the ash for 17 centuries, until their rediscovery gave us the single greatest window we possess into ordinary Roman life. The Thermopolium counter we visited earlier tonight came from that ash. Rome's greatest tragedy became, in the very long run, its most generous gift to memory. Then, spanning most of the 2nd century, came the stretch that later ages looked back on with heartbreak, the era of the so-called 5 good emperors. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing 17 centuries later, made the famous judgment that if you had to pick the period in all history when the human race was most happy and prosperous, you would choose this one. That's debatable. Ask an enslaved miner in Spain. But it measures the afterglow. Part of the secret was an accident that looked like wisdom. For a run of reigns, no emperor had a surviving natural son, so each chose his successor, adopting the most capable man available, training him, sharing power before the handover. Merit grafted onto monarchy. Trajan, the soldier under whom the empire reached its greatest size ever, from Britain to the Persian Gulf. For centuries afterward, the Senate's prayer for each new emperor was that he be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. Adrian, the restless Greek-loving traveller, who spent half his reign on the road, walking the frontiers of his own realm, and who decided the empire was too big and marked its limits in stone. His wall still runs across northern England. Antoninus Pius, whose reign was so peaceful that historians complain there is almost nothing to write about. Perhaps the quietest compliment a ruler has ever received. And then, at the summit, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher on the throne. Plato had once dreamed of philosopher kings. Rome, of all places, produced one. And history, with its taste for irony, gave the gentlest of emperors 19 years of almost uninterrupted calamity. Floods, wars on 2 frontiers at once, and a plague carried home by the army from the east that burned through the empire for years and killed millions. He spent his last decade not in Rome, but in army camps on the Danube, in the cold, an aging man with a weak stomach fighting wars he never wanted. And at night, in his tent, he wrote, not propaganda, not memoirs, but private notes to himself, in Greek. Reminders, how to stay decent, how to meet anger with patience, how to accept what you cannot control, and act rightly within what you can. He never meant anyone to read them. We have them. We call them the Meditations, and they are still in print in every language on earth. The diary of the most powerful man alive, coaching himself, gently, to be good. Somewhere in those pages he wrote a line worth taking into sleep with you. That when you wake in the morning, reluctant to rise, remember, you are getting up to do the work of a human being. Marcus died on the frontier in 180 AD, and here the pattern broke in the oldest way. He had a surviving son. Commodus, vain, lazy, and enchanted by the arena, an emperor who scandalized Rome by performing as a gladiator, undid in a dozen years what 4 reigns had built, and died strangled in his bath by a wrestler on New Year's Eve. After Commodus, the pattern of the terrible year of the 4 emperors repeated itself. Rival armies, a civil war, and out of it marched the founder of Rome's last stable dynasty for a long while. Septimius Severus, a soldier emperor born in Leptis Magna in North Africa, whose native accent reportedly never left him. Rome was now an empire that could be ruled from anywhere, by anyone the legions loved. And Severus understood the new arithmetic perfectly. His deathbed advice to his sons, as Dio records it, was the Principate stripped of every remaining illusion. Stay united, enrich the soldiers, and despise everyone else. His sons did not stay united. Caracalla murdered his brother Gaeta in their mother's arms, ruled harshly, raised the army's pay as instructed, and, in 212, signed the edict we met out on the frontier, making nearly every free inhabitant of the empire a citizen. He also gave Rome the most colossal of its bath complexes, whose ruins still stage operas today. The dynasty guttered on through assassinations and boy emperors, managed by their formidable Syrian mothers and grandmothers. For a stretch, the empire was effectively run by women the constitution had no words for, until, in 235, the last Severan was killed by his own troops. With him died the last pretense of stability. What came next was the half-century of chaos we are about to enter. The historian Cassius Dio, who lived through the change, wrote the epitaph for the Golden Age in a single image. With Marcus's death, he said, history descended from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. The edge of the world. Before we follow Rome into its long twilight, let's go out to the edge for a moment. Away from the marble, out to where the empire actually ended, and to the men who stood on that line. Picture a rampart in the north of Britain, or a timber watchtower above the Rhine, or a mud brick fort on the fringe of the Syrian desert. It is the middle of the night. A sentry leans on the parapet, cloak pulled tight, looking out at the dark. At the lands Rome does not rule. Behind him, in every direction for 1,000 miles or more, one law, one coinage, one network of roads. In front of him, the rest of the world. For centuries, on frontiers like this one, that line was held by a force that, at its height, numbered only around 300,000 men, legionaries and auxiliaries together, guarding an empire of perhaps 60 or 70 million people. One soldier for every couple hundred civilians, stretched along thousands of miles of river, wall, and sand. That it held at all is one of the marvels of history. So let's meet the man on the wall. He is, first of all, a volunteer, a professional, not a conscript. He signed on for 25 years, a whole adult life. If he lives to discharge, he receives a plot of land or a cash bonus, and if he began as a provincial auxiliary rather than a citizen legionary, the true prize, Roman citizenship, for himself and his children, inscribed on a folding bronze tablet he will keep like treasure. His day is not mostly battle. His day is mostly work. Roman soldiers were the empire's construction corps. They dug the ditches, raised the walls, built the forts they lived in, and laid the roads they marched on. Drill with weighted weapons, 20-mile training marches under a load. Modern soldiers would recognize with a groan endless routines of watch and inspection. A writer of the age observed that Roman drills were bloodless battles, and Roman battles bloody drills. Discipline was the whole religion of the army. Its punishments could be savage, up to the infamous decimation of disgraced units, though by the imperial period that horror was vanishingly rare. What remained was the habit, the legion as a machine of habits, drilled so deep that fear had trouble finding room. And here is the thing our sentry would want you to know. We have their voices. At a fort called Vindolanda, just south of Hadrian's Wall, the waterlogged soil preserved hundreds of thin wooden writing tablets, the actual correspondence of a garrison, ink on wood, 19 centuries old. And they are not dispatches about glory. They are requests for more beer for the lads. Accounts of socks and underwear being sent from home, thank goodness, because Britain is freezing. A note calling the local Britons a rude nickname. And the loveliest of them all, a birthday party invitation from the commander's wife's friend, Claudia Severa. "Make sure you come," she writes, "it will make the day so much better." With a closing line added in her own hand, one of the earliest surviving pieces of writing in Latin by a woman. Sisters inviting each other to birthday parties at the end of the world. That was the frontier, too. The Fort Our Sentry Guards is a small Rome in miniature. Headquarters building, granaries raised on pillars against damp and rats, a hospital, a bathhouse, of course a bathhouse, and, sprawling outside the gates, the Vicus, the civilian village of traders, taverns and families that grew beside every camp. Soldiers were long forbidden to legally marry during service. They formed households anyway, and the army eventually shrugged and recognized them. Many forts never left. Look at a map of Europe tonight and you can still read the army's footprints. Cities whose names remember the camp, the castra, in their endings. Manchester, Lancaster, Doncaster, Chester itself. Cologne is simply the colony. Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, York, legionary bases, everyone. And binding fort to fort, province to province, ran the roads. 50,000 miles or more of paved highway at the system's height. Enough, if laid in a line, to wrap the planet twice. Plus hundreds of thousands of miles of lesser roads. Surveyed with an instrument of hanging plumb lines, built in layers, cambered to shed rain, milestoned all the way back to the golden marker Augustus set in the Forum. They ran straight because they were built for the legion's stride, not the merchant's mule, but the merchants inherited them, and so did everyone since. Beneath a startling number of Europe's modern routes lies a Roman road still doing its job. When people say all roads lead to Rome, they are quoting a memory of a real network. And the state post that galloped along it could move an urgent message a couple hundred miles in a day. A speed Europe would struggle to match again for 1,000 years. Our sentry's shift is measured by water clocks and trumpet calls. 4 watches divide the night. Somewhere behind him, his mates sleep 8 to a room in the barracks. Somewhere ahead, beyond the dark, are people who will one day be called Scots, or Germans, or Persians. Some enemies, many of them trading partners, in-laws, future recruits. The frontier was never really a sealed wall, it was a membrane. Goods crossed, gods crossed, people crossed. Rome's border posts collected customs duties, not just scalps. And slowly, this is the quiet, enormous fact of the whole imperial centuries. The provinces stopped being conquered lands and became simply Rome. Emperors came from Spain, from Africa, from Syria, from the Balkans. And in 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla, son of an African father and a Syrian mother, a family we will meet properly soon, signed an edict granting Roman citizenship to virtually every free inhabitant of the empire. Tens of millions of people, at a stroke. His motives may have included the tax rolls. Cynics said so at the time, but the meaning outran the motive. The word Roman no longer described where you were born. It described what you belonged to. Stand with the sentry one more moment. Wind on the rampart, the watchfire snapping softly. Rome, all of it. The fountains, the courts, the bakeries, the birthday parties, at his back, held safe by the simple fact of him standing there, awake so that others could sleep. Someone has always done that work in every age. Someone is doing it tonight while you drift. Let him keep the watch. You're relieved of duty. The gods and the quiet mind. We are inside the pantheon now, the temple to all the gods, rebuilt by Adrian, still standing today, still crowned by the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. Above us, at the top of the dome, is a perfect circle open to the sky, the oculus, the eye. By day, a column of sunlight swings through this room like the hand of a clock. Tonight, it shows a circle of stars. There is no better room in the world in which to ask, what did the Romans believe? Not quite what we might expect. Roman religion, at its ancient core, was less about belief than about practice, less a creed than a contract. The Romans even had a lawyer's phrase for it, do ut des. I give so that you may give. Perform the rituals correctly, keep the sacrifices coming, maintain the pax deorum, the peace with the gods, and the gods in turn keep the harvest growing and the enemy out. Get a single word of the ritual wrong, and you started over from the beginning. It was religion as maintenance, religion as infrastructure, which for Rome may be the highest category there is. The great Olympians, borrowed from the Greeks and renamed, presided over the state. Jupiter of the sky and oaths, Juno, Minerva, Mars, who mattered far more in Rome than Ares ever did in Greece, because Rome knew what business it was in. But the truly Roman layer of the sacred was smaller and closer to home. Every house had its shrine, the lararium, where the family's own guardian spirits were honored daily. A candle-lit cupboard of household gods. Spirits of the pantry, spirits of the doorway, the god of the door itself, Janus, faced both ways at once and gave his name to the month where the years hinge. January. The sacred, for a Roman, began at the threshold of your own home, and it extended backward through the ancestors. The death masks of the family's great men kept in the hall, brought out and worn at funerals, so that at the burial of a Roman noble, all his ancestors, in a sense, walked with him one more time. They were also, let's say it fondly, magnificently superstitious. No public business without taking the auspices, reading the will of the gods in the flight of birds, the appetite of the sacred chickens, the livers of sacrificed animals. Days were lucky or unlucky. The calendar marked them. There is a famous story from the wars with Carthage of an admiral told the sacred chickens refused to eat, a terrible omen, who snapped that if they wouldn't eat, they could drink, and threw them into the sea. He lost the battle. Rome noticed. Curses were written on lead and nailed into the earth. Ghosts were fed at annual festivals so they would stay quiet. Words themselves had power. Rome kept the city's secret protective name, some ancients claimed unspoken, so no enemy could ever call its guardian gods away. And into this open, crowded, absorbent system, the empire poured new gods the way it poured new citizens. Isis from Egypt, Mithras of the soldiers' underground chapels, the Great Mother from Anatolia, the deified emperors, and, from one small province on the eastern edge, a faith unlike the others, one that would not share the shrine with anyone, and which, in one of history's fullest reversals, would in time inherit Rome itself. But that story belongs to the next chapter, because alongside the temples, Rome nurtured another way of meeting the universe, one that asked not, "What must I offer the gods?" but, "How should a human being live?" Philosophy came from Greece, like so much else, and Rome, practical to its bones, kept what could be used. Epicureans taught that the world is atoms and void, that the gods do not concern themselves with us, and that the good life is the quiet one. Friendship, simple pleasures, freedom from fear. The poet Lucretius turned it all into verse of strange midnight beauty, arguing that death is nothing to us. Where death is, we are not. Where we are, death is not, and that we no more suffer after life than we suffered in the endless ages before we were born. But the philosophy Rome truly made its own, the one people still reach for today, by name in hard seasons, was Stoicism. Strip away the marble and the Greek terminology, and the Stoic teaching is almost unbearably simple. Some things are up to you, your judgments, your choices, your responses. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, the behavior of others, the length of your own life, is not. Suffering, the Stoics taught, comes from confusing the two, from staking your peace on things the world can take. Virtue, being just, courageous, temperate, wise, is the only good that can't be taken. Everything else is on loan. What gives Roman Stoicism its permanent power is who taught it, and from where. Seneca, the richest courtier in Nero's Rome, tutor to the tyrant, writing luminous letters about tranquility while navigating a court that finally ordered his death. A man whose life often fell short of his philosophy and who admitted it, which is perhaps the most relatable thing about him. Epictetus, born a slave, lame, later banished, teaching in a bare room that no one can harm your true self without your consent. His handbook opens with that one distinction: what is up to us and what is not, as the beginning of all peace. And Marcus Aurelius, the emperor we met in his tent on the Danube, proof that the philosophy of a slave and the philosophy of the master of the world could be, word for word, the same philosophy. A slave, a courtier, and an emperor, all teaching the same quiet lesson. That range is the argument, and the Stoics had a practice made for this hour of the night. Seneca describes it. At day's end, when the lamp is out, review the day, gently. Where was I too harsh? Where did I do well? What will I mend tomorrow? Not to punish yourself, he is explicit about that. His image is of appearing before a judge who is on your side. Examine the day, forgive what needs forgiving, resolve what needs resolving, and then let it go completely, so that sleep comes to a settled mind. Whatever your own faith or philosophy, that practice is freely available tonight under this circle of stars in the dome. The day you had is finished. It is now one of the things not up to you. You did what you did. You'll mend what you'll mend. And the verdict, from the judge who is on your side, is Enough. Enough for today. Marcus, in his tent, put the release even more simply. You have to leave it all somewhere. Leave it here. The Long Twilight. Every telling of Rome ends with the same question, and it is the wrong question, but we will honor it anyway, because it has been asked for 1500 years. Why did Rome fall? The wrong part is the word fall. It suggests a single crash, a statue toppling, one bad afternoon. What actually happened took longer than the entire history of the United States has taken so far. Rome did not fall the way a tree falls. It fell the way a long evening falls, so gradually that the people living through it argued about whether it was happening at all. So let's walk the twilight slowly. We're in no hurry. Neither, as it turned out, was Rome. The golden afternoon ended in the 3rd century. Between the years 235 and 284, one human lifetime, the empire nearly died. Historians call it plainly the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors rose and fell like weather, dozens of them, and claimants beyond counting, most raised by their armies and murdered by their armies, some reigning mere months. Civil war became the background condition, and every legion pulled off the frontier to fight for its general left a gap, through which came the raids, Goths across the Danube, and even by sea into the Aegean, Franks and Alemanni over the Rhine, and in the east, a new, aggressive Persian dynasty that inflicted on Rome one of its most shocking humiliations. An emperor, Valerian, captured alive in battle, dying in Persian captivity. Rome did not ransom him. There were, at the time, other emperors to worry about. Add plague, a second great pandemic, decades long. Add the money itself failing. Emperors, desperate to pay soldiers, minted coins with less and less silver, until the proud denarius was a washed copper token, and prices tore loose from all memory. For a while, the empire simply came apart. A breakaway Gallic empire in the west, and in the east, the merchant queen Zenobia of Palmyra, carving out a realm from Syria to Egypt. By every reasonable measure, the story should end there, in the 260s. It doesn't. Because Rome produced, from the ranks, one more generation of Iron Men, soldier emperors from the Balkan provinces, born peasants, raised by the legions, who stitched the empire back together piece by piece. And then one of them sat down and rebuilt the state itself. His name was Diocletian, and he was something Rome had not seen in 100 years. An organizer. He concluded that the empire was too vast for one man, and simply institutionalized that fact, splitting rule among colleagues, an Augustus for the east and one for the west, each with a junior. He multiplied the provinces, separated civil from military power, so no governor could easily rebel, fixed prices by decree. That part failed, as price decrees do, and dropped, at last, the thread-worn costume of the Republic. No more first citizen. The emperor was now dominus, lord, diademed, robed in purple, approached with prostration. Augustus had hidden the monarchy inside a republic. Diocletian took it out and set it on an altar. And then this Balkan peasant emperor did the most Roman Republic thing imaginable, 3 centuries too late. He retired. Voluntarily. the only emperor ever to simply resign the purple and walk away to a colossal seaside palace in his homeland, where, when begged to return to power, he replied, in effect, "If you could see the cabbages I am growing with my own hands, you would not ask." His palace still stands. The old town of Split in Croatia lives inside its walls to this day, a city inhabiting an emperor's retirement home, which is the entire afterlife of Rome in one image. Diocletian's orderly system of colleagues, of course, collapsed into civil war the moment he left it, because of course it did. And out of those wars rose the man who bends all of later history around himself. Constantine. 2 decisions. That's all we need from him tonight, but they are 2 of the largest decisions anyone has ever made. The first, before a battle for Rome itself, at the Milvian Bridge over the Tiber. In 312, Constantine came to believe. The accounts differ on visions, dreams, and signs in the sky, that his victory belonged to the God of the Christians, and he marked his soldiers' shields accordingly. He won, and the following year, the persecuted sect from the eastern provinces, illegal, intermittently hunted, perhaps 1/10 of the population, was granted full toleration. Within Constantine's own lifetime, it was the favored faith of the court. Within 80 years, it was the official religion of the empire, and it was the old gods' temples that stood closed. The faith of fishermen and slaves had inherited the empire that crucified its founder. Rome's last and greatest absorption, or its conquest from within. Both descriptions are true, and Rome, as ever, contained both. The second decision, he built a new capital. On the Bosphorus, at the ancient Greek town of Byzantium, where Europe looks at Asia across a mile of water, rose New Rome, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The center of gravity, which had been sliding eastward for a century toward the money and the cities and the armies, now had an address. Hold that city in your mind. It is the trapdoor in the story of the fall. Because here is what actually happened, and it happened slowly, and mostly it happened only in the West. The empire settled into 2 administrative halves, east and west, usually cooperating, drifting apart. The east had the deeper purse, the older cities, the shorter frontiers. The west had the long, cold rivers, and beyond them, whole peoples in motion. In the late 300s, a new force from the steppes, the Huns, crashed into the tribes of Eastern Europe like a stone into still water, and the ripples were nations. Goths, and later Vandals and others, pressing against the rivers, not as raiders now, but as refugees and migrants, armed, desperate and numerous, asking or forcing their way in. In 378 at Adrianople, a Roman emperor fell in battle against the Goths, the worst defeat in centuries. In the winter of 406, the Rhine frontier was crossed en masse and never fully restored. Britain was told, in effect, to look to its own defence. The legions there simply were not replaced. And in 410, something happened that made the whole Mediterranean world go quiet. Alaric and his Goths, Christian Goths note, the world had already changed, entered Rome itself and sacked it for 3 days. Rome had not fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. since those Gauls back near the beginning of our story. The news reached Jerome, translating scripture in his cell in Bethlehem, and he wrote that his voice stuck in his throat. The city which had taken the whole world, itself taken. In Africa, Augustine began writing The City of God to answer the pagans who said the old gods were having their revenge, arguing that no earthly city, not even Rome, was ever the point. The last Western decades are a long diminuendo. The court withdrew to the marsh-guarded city of Ravenna. Real power passed to generals, many of barbarian descent, making and unmaking child emperors. The Vandals took Africa, the tax base, the grain, and in 455 sacked Rome again, more thoroughly, leaving their tribal name embedded forever in our word for wanton destruction. Attila the Hun burned his way toward Italy and turned back after meeting, among others, an unarmed bishop of Rome. A scene the following centuries never forgot when they considered who now truly presided in the Eternal City. And in 476, an army officer named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor and did not bother appointing another. He sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople with the message that one emperor was enough. The deposed boy's name, and history occasionally writes its own poetry, was Romulus. Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. The founder's name and the first emperor's name joined in the last. He was not executed. He was pensioned off to a villa in the south of Italy, and there he disappears from the record. The fall of the Roman Empire ending not with fire, but with a teenager retiring to the seaside. Many people alive that year probably did not notice the empire fall. The consuls were still named. The Senate still met. It goes on appearing in the record for another century and more. The new Gothic kings of Italy minted coins with imperial faces, kept the Roman law, repaired the aqueducts. The evening light, as we said, fades slowly. And the trapdoor, the East did not fall. The Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, Greek-speaking, Christian, and calling itself Roman to the very end, its people, the Romaioi, endured for another 1,000 years. It kept Roman law, and under the Emperor Justinian compiled it into the Great Code that became the foundation of legal systems across most of the world today. It stood until 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, 39 years before Columbus sailed. There were people who walked the earth in the lifetime of the printing press who were, by any honest definition, Romans. So when did Rome fall? 476, 1453, or consider the office of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome, once held by Julius Caesar himself, survives as a title of the Pope in Rome tonight. The Senate's alphabet is the one this script is written in. Rome's law shapes the courts. Rome's language fills the sciences. Rome's concrete dome still stands unbroken over the Pantheon, with the rain falling through the eye onto the marble floor, as it has for 1900 years. Perhaps the truest answer is the strangest one. Rome never exactly fell. It dissolved into us. We're back where we started. The Seven Hills, the slow brown river bending around its island. If you listen, You can almost hear the whole story held inside this one small valley. The shepherds' fires, the carts on the stones, the fountains, the trumpets on the frontier, the pens scratching in a tent on the Danube. All of it rose from here. And it's quiet now. The Romans had a phrase they carved on sundials and wrote at the ends of letters. Sic transit gloria mundi. So passes the glory of the world. They knew better than almost anyone, because they had inherited the ruins of others before leaving their own. Everything built gets handed on. Nothing is kept. Everything is given forward. The aqueduct becomes the bridge, becomes the road you drove today. The month keeps its emperor's name long after anyone bows. The words keep traveling, mouth to mouth, into languages Rome never heard, into this one, into this room, tonight. You don't need to hold any of it. That was never the assignment. Let the dates go. Let the names go. The wolf, the brothers, the generals, the philosophers in their tents. They kept their watch a long time ago, and kept it well, and now the watch is not yours either. The city is asleep. The river is running in the dark, the way it was running before anyone named it, the way it will run tomorrow while you dream. I will leave the fire running a little longer. Rest well. Till we meet again, traveller.